over this past 12 months and all the experience that has entailed, we have been learning a lot about connections. I wonder what comes to mind for you when you start to think about being connected. Perhaps you might think of the very digital sense. Here are just some of the cables that are needed for our service to be broadcast live each Sunday. In a digital sense, we've been imagining all sorts of different connections. So too, in a relational sense, we've had to think about how we can be alongside those that we love and care for. Perhaps that's been going for a walk outside, or perhaps that's been communicating via video or telephone, or even a good old-fashioned letter. We have thought hard about how we connect to one another when all our patterns have changed. Likewise, we have thought carefully about how we connect to the environment around. We've seen what's happened as areas have been rewilded as we've changed our pattern of life. This is a passage about Jesus, the true vine. It invites us to think about ecology, but of course, all around we see different ways in which we connect with the nature and how we make sure that we care for nature. Over this past year, we've been thinking about that connection. Likewise, we have continued to think about how we connect in the spiritual sense. So many of the familiar patterns have been disrupted, and yet we've been able to continue to connect in faith through using digital media, through listening, through singing, through worshipping in our homes instead of together. But likewise, in this year, we have seen people connect with faith in a new way, perhaps even for the first time. So then, with all these connections, what does it mean to be connected to Jesus, the true vine, whose Father in heaven is the gardener? We think about how we are spiritually connected, but this passage here is very much a disciple-centric passage. It's part of what is referred to as the farewell discourse. Jesus preparing these disciples that have been close to him for his ministry. He is preparing them for what is ahead. And with it, he is calling them to continue to remain connected in the faith to which they have been called. But for all that it is a very disciple-centric passage, it doesn't stop us from looking carefully at what it might mean for us. But in order to explore that further, let's consider carefully what it means for the disciples. Here's how the passage starts. Jesus says, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, so that it will be even more fruitful." This is an abrupt and yet clear introduction to what we see going on here. You see, there is an abrupt sense of thinking about how God relates to his people. The metaphor of a vine would be one that is familiar in the Old Testament context. And yet Jesus is being abrupt and even disruptive by asserting that he is the true vine. And with that, he is making this connection, a connection that's already been seen in the other I am statements, this connection to his Father in heaven. Now, Jesus describes his Father in heaven as the gardener. Now, translations will vary on this. We're thinking of the person who tends the vine. And again, this is quite abrupt in the statement of what this means. Some translations will have it as farmer, and that's perhaps a more literal translation. In fact, the authorized version of this word gerogos, and I hope I've got the translation right there. The authorized version has that as husbandman. In other words, the person who directs, who is in charge of what is going on. And that's what brings us to the kernel of this abruptness, because we hear about dead branches being cut off, and likewise living ones being pruned in order that they might grow more fruit. When we think of the person in charge of the vine, whatever title we might give them, what we are seeing is strategic and clear oversight that brings about the best for that vine. Now, in this, what we're seeing is death being cut out and life being fostered. So yes, it's an abrupt statement to talk about dead branches being cut out. And yes, it's an abrupt statement to assert that Jesus is the true vine. But what we are seeing here is true life being held up, and that being in contrast to death being defeated and cut out. When we start to frame it in that context, perhaps it starts to ring true of what we know in the gospel. We go on to see how this is quite a disciple-centric message when we look carefully at verse 3. This is what Jesus says to them, and kind of imagine this intimate scene as he's sharing with them. He says, "You are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. Remain in me," and the word remain is one that we'll continue to see in this passage. "Remain in me as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me." Jesus was calling the disciples to continue in this thrust in which he had already called them. There's this sense of continuing in that direction. Now, yes, this is where we see it's a very disciple-centric message. But we must remember that the message of the gospel is one that calls us to be a part of Christ's family. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 17, it says this: "If anyone is in Christ, they are a new creation." We are able to come in to be a part of this true and living vine. This was the experience that the disciples already knew. And this is the experience that we are invited to. And so when we look at this passage that then is calling them to continue to remain, there is this challenge that goes to us, this call that goes to us about how we can continue in the faith. And so, if we know this hope that is found in Jesus, a living way, a true and living way where death has been defeated, where life, true life, is offered to us because of his death and resurrection, we live out this hope. And if we're living out that hope, if that hope has been discovered and honed and held onto, then the call of the disciple is to continue to hold on to it. Now, the disciples that we read of here that Jesus is speaking to would go through so much turmoil and challenge. And yet Jesus' words are consistent to them to remain in him, the true vine. And so likewise they echo to us. No matter what the up and down experience is for us as individuals, no matter what the up and down experience is for the church locally and nationally and internationally, this call again and again is to remain in Jesus, the true vine. Here's what Jesus says to the disciples where he returns to that I am statement in verse 5. He says, "I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. If you do not remain in me, you are like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up and thrown into the fire and burned. If you remain in me, my words remain in you. Ask whatever you wish, and it will be done. This too is my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourself to be my disciples." Jesus then goes on to talk about the Father's love and how that's seen in him and how we should do likewise. I want to centre though on some key things that we can learn about this call to remain. The first of these is a simple but clear one, and that is this sense of warning. And the warning is clear. Don't lose that connection. We know what happens when our connections are lost in the digital sense. It's frustrating, or perhaps we know the hurt and the heartache that comes with severed connections in the relational sense, where we haven't been able to connect in the familiar ways with those that we love. We know the hurt and all the anguish that goes along with our severed connection from ecology and the natural world. We see the burden of that. We know what it is for connections to be broken down. Well, this is certainly true in the spiritual sense. we should be aware that there is a risk. There is a risk in being apart from the true and living vine. It seems abrupt, but the call is clear. Remain. Remain in me. And with this assurance that is bolstered by the work of the Holy Spirit that's covered in the chapter before, as I was saying earlier, with this assurance and with this hope, we're reminded that we are on a path towards blessing and abundance. The word used in this context for those who remain in the true vine is one of fruit, of blossoming and seeing the fruit of that. It says this, that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples. Now, there is a bit of question among scholars about what that fruit might mean. Perhaps it is the sense of the fruit of spiritual living. Maybe it's the fruit in terms of a fellowship that grows and welcomes new people, and that's certainly something we saw in the early church and that we continue to see today, where new faces are made welcome. For all that there might be a division, and for all that there might be cases made for the different kinds of fruit that there might be, I feel we're kind of going up a path that doesn't really lead us anywhere if we're trying to define it. Because rather than trying to define it, we should be trusting in the one who leads us to that fruit. We should be trusting in God, the farmer, gardener, husbandman, whatever title we might use. Trust in what he is bringing about, and trust that the different ways in which we see fruit is of God. Now, as I said earlier, we then get these examples of self-giving love. Jesus says this, my command is that you love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command. Jesus would call the disciples, those who are committed to remaining in him, to live out this life of love. And indeed, he would give the greatest example of that by laying down his life. My closing challenge is to choose the way of Jesus. Jesus, who is the true and living vine, and God, who is the gardener or farmer. Because in Jesus, the true vine, we see a living way. We see a death-defeating way. We see a way that is full of life and of hope. And so my invitation to you, whether you're already connected or perhaps exploring that connection or even re-establishing that connection, is to choose the way that is living. Choose the way that leads to life and fruit and hope.